Don't look them in the eyes, the older German woman whispered as the train wheels screamed against the tracks somewhere deep in Louisiana. The words moved through the crowded boxcar like cold smoke. Nobody answered her. Nobody needed to. 43 German women sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches bolted to the walls, their gray uniforms damp with sweat from the southern heat that pressed through the slats in the train car like steam from an oven. The air smelled of rust, wet wood, and fear. Greta Hoffman sat near the far corner beside a cracked window no wider than her hand. She was 29 years old, though the war had already stolen enough from her face to make her seem older. A faded Red Cross patch still clung to the sleeve of her coat. She had worked as a nurse in field hospitals outside Tunis before surrendering to American forces months earlier. Since then, the world had become a sequence of trains, fences, waiting rooms, and unfamiliar skies. Across from her, a younger girl named Lise rubbed her trembling hands together over and over again. "Is it true?" she asked quietly in German. "What they said about the black American soldiers?" Nobody answered at first. Outside, rainwater left from the morning storm glimmered beside the tracks beneath the heavy afternoon sun. Then the older woman spoke again without lifting her eyes. "They said they were savages." The train car fell silent after that. Greta stared through the narrow opening beside her shoulder as pine trees slid past in endless green blurs. For years, she had seen the propaganda posters in train stations and newspapers. Black American soldiers drawn with monstrous faces, wild eyes, cruel smiles. Germany had fed those images to its people until fear became automatic, until entire generations learned to fear people they had never actually seen. Greta wanted to believe those posters had been lies. But fear did not disappear simply because logic asked it to. The train finally slowed. Metal groaned beneath them. Somewhere outside, an American whistle blew sharp through the humid air. Several women stiffened instantly. One quietly began praying beneath her breath. Greta felt sweat sliding down the back of her neck as the wheels screeched harder against the rails. Then came silence. Not complete silence. The distant buzzing of cicadas filled the air outside. Boots moved across gravel somewhere nearby. A truck engine rumbled low in the distance. But inside the train car, nobody moved. Nobody breathed loudly. Then the lock turned. The heavy door slid open with a violent burst of white sunlight. Heat flooded the car immediately. Thick Louisiana heat. Wet and alive. Greta lifted one hand against the brightness. For a second, she saw only shapes standing outside beneath the blazing sun. Then her eyes adjusted. The platform stretched across the camp entrance in long strips of weathered wood. Guard towers rose above the fences in the distance. American flags moved lazily in the hot wind. And standing beside the train in perfect formation were 6 black American soldiers in spotless uniforms. Nobody inside the car spoke. Greta felt the entire atmosphere change around her. Every woman in the boxcar stared at the soldiers with the same frozen expression. Confusion, fear, disbelief. The men did not yell. They did not laugh. They stood perfectly still beneath the afternoon sun, rifles resting calmly against their shoulders, uniforms pressed clean despite the heat. One soldier adjusted his cap slightly. Another wiped sweat from his forehead with a folded cloth. Their movements were ordinary, human. Greta did not understand why that disturbed her more than cruelty would have. An American officer stepped forward beside the platform. "One line," he said sharply. "Move carefully." His accent rolled heavy and southern. The women slowly climbed down from the train one by one. Greta watched their faces carefully as they stepped onto American soil. Some looked terrified. Others simply looked exhausted. Then Lee slipped. Her worn boot caught against the metal edge of the train step. Her body pitched forward suddenly toward the gravel below. Several women gasped at once. But before she struck the ground, one of the black soldiers moved. Fast, calm, precise. He crossed the distance in 2 long strides and caught her gently beneath both arms. The motion looked practiced, almost instinctive. Lise froze completely inside his grip. The soldier steadied her carefully before letting go immediately. No roughness, no anger, no mocking smile, just professionalism. "Easy now," he said quietly. His voice was deep but controlled. Greta stared at him. The soldier was tall, perhaps 6'2", broad-shouldered beneath the dark green uniform. Sweat glistened across his forehead under the Louisiana heat, but his posture remained perfectly straight. A silver sergeant stripe rested across his sleeve. Sergeant Elijah Brooks. Greta would learn his name later. But in that moment, she only noticed his eyes. Calm eyes. Tired eyes. Human eyes. Lee stepped backward quickly, stunned speechless. The soldier simply nodded once and returned to his position beside the platform. Nothing about the exchange matched the images Greta carried inside her head. Around her, the other women seemed equally shaken. The older woman who had whispered warnings on the train now looked unable to speak at all. The line slowly moved forward toward the processing yard. Gravel crunched beneath dozens of worn shoes. Somewhere nearby, jazz music drifted faintly from a radio inside one of the barracks buildings. Greta caught the smell of coffee moving through the hot air. Real coffee, not substitute powder from wartime Germany. The scent alone almost hurt. As they walked deeper into the camp, Greta noticed more details that made no sense to her. American soldiers carrying boxes of supplies laughed together near a truck. A medic handed water canteens to two exhausted prisoners without hesitation. Nobody shouted insults. Nobody struck anyone. The camp itself looked strangely ordinary beneath the afternoon sun. Wooden barracks, laundry lines moving in the breeze, screens on windows, fans humming somewhere inside the buildings. Greta had prepared herself for brutality. Instead, everything felt controlled, organized, quiet. That frightened her in a completely different way. Because if the propaganda had lied about this, what else had it lied about? Ahead of her, Sergeant Brooks opened the mess hall door for the prisoners entering the compound. The gesture was so small, Greta almost missed it. He simply held the door open while the women filed past him one by one. But when Greta stepped through the doorway, she noticed something impossible. He deliberately lowered his eyes so the women would not feel intimidated passing beside him. It was the smallest act of restraint she had ever seen from a soldier. Greta felt something inside her shift slightly. Not trust. Not yet. But something quieter. Something more dangerous. Doubt. The mess hall smelled like coffee, soap, and bacon grease warming beneath electric lights. Greta stood near the entrance beside the other women, her hands clenched tightly behind her back as ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. The room itself looked nothing like the camps she had imagined during the Atlantic crossing. White wooden walls. Long tables scrubbed clean. Tin cups stacked beside steaming metal containers. Somewhere near the kitchen, a radio played low American jazz through static. The music sounded soft and distant beneath the hum of voices. Nobody moved toward the food. The German women simply stood there in silence, staring at trays filled with scrambled eggs, toast, oatmeal, and thick slices of bacon glistening under the lights. Real food. Hot food. It looked impossible. Greta felt her stomach tighten painfully at the smell alone. Around her, several women exchanged nervous glances. One quietly crossed herself. Another whispered, "Do not eat too quickly." The older woman from the train leaned closer to Greta. "There could be medicine in it," she murmured. Greta did not answer. Part of her wanted to dismiss the fear as ridiculous. Another part remembered years of propaganda films warning that Americans preferred humiliation to bullets. She stared at the coffee especially. Dark steam curled upward from the metal urn near the counter. Real coffee had become almost mythical in Germany by 1945. Most civilians drank burned barley water and pretended not to notice the difference. Here, the smell filled the entire room. Rich, bitter, alive. An American cook wearing a stained white apron stepped from behind the serving line. "Food gets cold either way," he said casually while wiping his hands on a towel. The women did not move. Greta noticed several American guards watching quietly from the far wall. Not mockingly, not impatiently, just observing. Then Sergeant Elijah Brooks entered the mess hall. The entire room seemed to notice him immediately, though he made almost no sound crossing the floor. He removed his cap near the doorway and wiped sweat from his forehead with a folded handkerchief before walking toward the coffee urn. Greta watched him carefully without understanding why. He poured himself a cup slowly. Steam rolled across his face beneath the electric lights. Then, without speaking to anyone, he sat alone at the nearest table and drank the coffee in full view of the prisoners. One sip. Calm. Ordinary. He broke a piece of toast in half afterward and ate it while looking through paperwork beside his elbow. Nothing about the moment felt staged. That was what unsettled Greta most. If this was theater, it was remarkably detailed. Across the room, Lise finally stepped toward the serving line first. Hesitantly, like someone approaching a wild animal. The cook handed her a tray without expression. Eggs, bacon, toast, coffee. Lise carried the tray back to the table with trembling hands while every woman watched her. She stared at the food for several seconds before taking a tiny bite of toast. Then another. Her shoulders loosened slightly. Around the room, more women slowly moved toward the counter one by one. Greta remained standing. She did not trust herself to move yet. Hunger complicated dignity. It made people vulnerable. But eventually the smell became unbearable. She stepped forward carefully toward the serving line. The cook glanced at her Red Cross patch briefly. "Nurse?" he asked. Greta hesitated before nodding once. "Used to be," she replied quietly in accented English. The cook scooped extra eggs onto her tray without comment. Greta looked at him in surprise. He shrugged. "You all look like you could use another helping." She carried the tray to an empty seat near the far wall beneath a spinning fan. The chair creaked softly beneath her weight. Around her, the room slowly filled with the sounds of eating. Forks against metal trays. Coffee cups. Settling onto tables. Quiet breathing. Nobody spoke much. The women seemed too stunned to waste energy on conversation. Greta wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup first. Heat spread through her fingers immediately. For several seconds, she simply stared at the dark liquid rising in soft curls of steam. Then she took one careful sip. Real cream. Real sugar. The taste nearly hurt. Across the room, Sergeant Brooks continued reviewing paperwork alone. Greta noticed something strange then. Every few minutes, he quietly watched the prisoners without making it obvious. Not suspiciously. More like a man checking whether frightened animals had finally started eating. Whenever one of the women looked up suddenly, he lowered his eyes again toward the papers in front of him. Deliberately non-threatening. Greta had never seen a soldier behave that way before. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the Louisiana sky. Rain clouds gathered slowly beyond the windows, darkening the afternoon light. The heat inside the mess hall thickened despite the fans overhead. One of the younger prisoners began eating too quickly beside Greta. Within minutes, the girl pressed both hands against her stomach, breathing hard. Greta reacted automatically before thinking. Nurse instincts survived war better than fear did. She moved beside the girl immediately, speaking softly in German. "Slow down. Smaller bites." The girl nodded weakly. Greta reached for the nearest water pitcher. Before she could lift it, another hand quietly placed a fresh cup beside her. Sergeant Brooks stood there holding the pitcher. Greta looked up sharply. Up close, he appeared older than she first assumed. Early 30s perhaps. Tiny lines rested near his eyes beneath the heat and exhaustion. He set the water beside the girl carefully. "Happens sometimes," he said softly. "People eat too fast after transport." Greta blinked in surprise. His voice carried no mockery, no tension, only experience. The young prisoner took slow breaths while sipping water carefully. Brooks waited long enough to make sure she stabilized before stepping back again. "Thank you," Greta said automatically in English. He nodded once. "You were a medic?" "Nurse. Army." Greta hesitated. "Field hospital." Brooks studied her for one quiet second before answering. "My sister is a nurse in Atlanta." The sentence caught Greta completely off guard. Not because of the words themselves. Because of the normalcy in them. A sister. A hospital. A family somewhere beyond the war. She realized suddenly that she had never once imagined Black American soldiers having ordinary lives before this moment. The thought embarrassed her instantly. Brooks adjusted the sleeve of his uniform slightly. "Storm is coming," he said while glancing toward the darkening windows. "Camp loses power sometimes during heavy rain. Do not panic if the lights flicker." Greta nodded slowly. Before she could respond again, another guard called his name from across the room. Brooks turned immediately toward the voice. "Coming," he answered. Then he walked away without another word. Greta watched him cross the mess hall beneath the dim lights while thunder rolled louder outside. Rain began striking the roof moments later. Heavy southern rain. The kind that sounded almost alive against wood and metal. Around her, the women continued eating silently. But the room had changed somehow. The fear was still there. Greta could feel it sitting quietly beneath every breath and glance. Yet another feeling had begun growing beside it now. Confusion. Dangerous confusion. Because monsters were supposed to be easy to recognize. And Sergeant Elijah Brooks had just handed water to a frightened German prisoner with the same calm gentleness her father once used carrying tea to sick neighbors during winter storms back in Hamburg. Greta stared down into her cooling coffee as rain hammered the camp outside. For the first time since arriving in America, she no longer knew what was true anymore. By the end of the second week, the camp no longer sounded frightening at night. Greta noticed that first. The noises had changed meaning. Boots crossing gravel after dark no longer made her heart race automatically. The low hum of generators sounded ordinary now. Even the whistles from the guard towers blended into the rhythm of camp life like distant train signals. Somewhere beyond the trees, Louisiana heat settled over everything each afternoon with thick, unbearable weight. Shirts clung to skin within minutes outdoors. The wooden barracks trapped warmth long after sunset. During work assignments, prisoners moved slower beneath the sun, conserving energy the way farmers did during harvest season. Greta spent most mornings inside the infirmary now, organizing supplies, changing dressings, and assisting the camp doctor with minor illnesses. The work steadied her mind. It reminded her there had once been a world before war where people measured time by ordinary things instead of survival. Some afternoons, she caught herself forgetting she was a prisoner at all. That frightened her more than the fences did. One humid evening near sunset, the camp lost power again. Not from a storm this time. Just overloaded generators struggling beneath the heat. Ceiling fans slowed to silence inside the barracks. Groans spread immediately through the crowded rooms as women waved folded newspapers beside flushed faces. Outside, the air hung thick and still beneath fading orange skies. Greta stepped onto the narrow barracks porch, searching for cooler air. The compound looked strangely peaceful in the dim evening light. Beyond the fences, pine trees stood motionless against the darkening horizon. Crickets buzzed loudly through the grass. Somewhere near the kitchens, somebody laughed softly beside clattering dishes. Then music drifted through the camp. A radio. Low jazz trumpet floating through the humid air. Greta followed the sound instinctively along the wooden walkway between barracks. Near the maintenance shed beside the western fence, she saw Sergeant Brooks sitting alone on an overturned crate beneath a lantern. His cap rested beside him. One sleeve remained rolled above his elbow from work duty earlier that day. The small radio beside his boot crackled softly through static while he repaired something metallic in his hands. Greta slowed immediately, unsure whether to continue walking or turn back. Brooks glanced up first. "Evening," he said calmly. Greta hesitated. "Good evening." He nodded toward the radio. "Generator problems again. Music helps people complain less." Greta almost smiled before stopping herself. The lantern beside him threw soft amber light across the fence line behind his shoulders. Sweat darkened the collar of his uniform from the lingering heat. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence felt oddly comfortable. Greta noticed the object in his hands then. A small wooden toy airplane with one broken wing. "You made that?" she asked quietly. Brooks looked down at it. "Trying to fix it." He turned the toy slightly beneath the lantern light. Cook's son dropped it during family visiting day. Greta stared at the tiny carved wings. The detail surprised her. "You carved this?" "Mostly during night shifts." He shrugged lightly. "Keeps my hands busy." Greta looked away toward the dark fence line. "My father used to build clocks," she said before realizing she had spoken out loud. Brooks leaned back slightly against the wall beside him. "In Hamburg." Greta nodded. "Small repair shop near the harbor." The words pulled old memories into her chest, so suddenly it almost hurt. Her father adjusting tiny brass gears beneath yellow workshop lamps. Her mother bringing coffee into the room during winter evenings. The sound of rain against apartment windows before the war changed every familiar thing into rubble and absence. Brooks studied her quietly for a moment. "You miss it." Greta gave a small humorless laugh. "There is not much left to miss anymore." The radio crackled softly beside them. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the Louisiana night. Brooks rested both hands on the unfinished airplane. "War takes homes from everybody," he said quietly. Greta looked at him carefully then. The lantern light softened the hard lines of his face. For the first time, she noticed how tired he always seemed beneath his calm expression. Not weak, just tired in the deep, permanent way soldiers often carried after too many years wearing uniforms. "Did you lose family?" she asked before thinking better of it. Brooks remained silent for several seconds. Then he nodded once. "Little brother." Greta lowered her eyes immediately. I am sorry. Pacific. His voice stayed even. Navy ship. He did not explain further. He did not need to. Greta understood the silence afterward. She had spent enough years inside hospitals to recognize grief when it settled quietly into somebody's posture. The radio switched songs then. Soft piano replaced the trumpet melody drifting through static beneath the hot night air. Greta realized suddenly that she no longer felt afraid standing there beside him. The thought unsettled her deeply. Because fear had once felt simple, useful. Fear created clean lines between people. Enemies, allies, monsters, victims. But Elijah Brooks kept destroying those lines simply by existing. A sudden burst of angry voices interrupted the quiet. Near the central yard, one of the younger American guards argued loudly with a prisoner work crew returning from kitchen duty. Greta stiffened automatically at the sound. The young guard sounded irritated and exhausted. Move faster, he snapped. You people act like the whole war was your fault. Several prisoners lowered their eyes immediately. Nobody answered. Then another voice cut through the tension. Calm. Firm. Sergeant Brooks stood up slowly beside the lantern. That is enough, Miller. The younger guard turned sharply. They are prisoners, Sergeant. Brooks walked toward him without raising his voice. Yes, prisoners. He paused beside the work crew. Not animals. The yard fell completely silent after that. Even the younger guard seemed embarrassed suddenly beneath the attention from nearby soldiers. Brooks held his gaze another second before speaking again. Get the men back to barracks. The younger guard muttered something under his breath, but obeyed immediately. Greta watched the entire exchange from the shadows near the maintenance shed. None of the prisoners moved for several seconds after the confrontation ended. One older German man quietly adjusted his cap before continuing toward the barracks without speaking. Brooks returned slowly toward the lantern afterward. He looked more tired now than angry. Greta studied him carefully as he sat back down beside the radio. You did not have to say anything, she said quietly. Brooks glanced toward the dark yard. Yes, he answered after a moment. I did. The simplicity of the response settled heavily inside her chest. Greta realized then that Elijah Brooks was probably forced to defend his own dignity every day inside the American Army itself. Yet somehow he still protected the dignity of prisoners who had once been taught to fear him. The thought left her strangely ashamed. The lantern flickered softly between them while crickets buzzed through the humid Louisiana darkness. Greta looked down at the unfinished wooden airplane resting beside his hand. One broken wing carefully repaired with fresh glue. You fix things, she said quietly. Brooks gave the faintest smile she had seen from him yet. Sometimes. Greta looked toward the fences stretching endlessly beneath the night sky. For the first time since arriving in America, she understood something terrifying. The war had not simply lied to her about one man. It had lied to her about humanity itself. The next morning arrived wrapped in thick white fog, drifting low across the camp yard. Louisiana mornings always carried strange weather after heavy heat. Mist clung to the fences and pine trees while dew collected along the wooden barracks roofs like silver beads beneath the pale sunrise. Greta walked toward the infirmary carrying a stack of folded linens against her chest. The camp felt quieter than usual. Even the guard spoke softly through the haze. Somewhere near the kitchens, bacon crackled on a stove while coffee drifted through the cool air. The smell reminded Greta painfully of Sunday mornings long before the war. She hated how often America did that now. Small, ordinary details breaking through memories she had tried to bury. As she crossed the yard, she noticed Sergeant Brooks standing beside the eastern fence line, speaking with another soldier near a supply truck. The fog softened everything around him. His uniform looked damp from morning moisture. One sleeve remained rolled slightly above the wrist from loading crates. Greta slowed her pace unconsciously. She had begun noticing him everywhere now. Not because he demanded attention, because he moved through the camp differently than anyone else. Quietly, deliberately, like a man constantly measuring the effect his presence had on other people. Brooks glanced toward her briefly while continuing his conversation. Just a simple nod in greeting. Greta returned the gesture automatically before continuing toward the infirmary steps. The exchange lasted less than 2 seconds. Yet somehow it stayed with her the entire morning. Inside the infirmary, the camp doctor sorted medical charts beside an open window while jazz music played softly through the radio on his desk. Greta organized supply shelves in silence. Outside, fog slowly burned away beneath rising heat until bright sunlight flooded the compound once again. By noon, the air had become heavy enough to taste. Prisoners working laundry duty moved slower beneath the sun. Guards wiped sweat from their necks with handkerchiefs every few minutes. Even the camp dogs slept beneath shaded porches with tongues hanging lazily from the heat. Around early afternoon, the infirmary door burst open suddenly. Lise stumbled inside, pale and shaking beside another prisoner. She fainted, the older woman said quickly in German. Greta moved immediately toward them. Lise's skin felt dangerously hot beneath her fingers. Heat exhaustion again. The doctor crossed the room carrying cold towels while Greta guided the younger woman carefully onto a cot near the window. Slow breathing. Greta instructed softly while pressing a damp cloth against Lise's forehead. Outside, voices gathered near the infirmary steps. Greta glanced toward the doorway and saw several prisoners lingering nervously outside beneath the brutal sunlight. Sergeant Brooks arrived seconds later carrying 2 additional water containers against his chest. Without speaking, he placed them beside the cots before moving toward the open windows. One by one, he pushed each window wider to increase airflow through the room. The smallest gestures. Efficient. Thoughtful. Greta watched him silently while adjusting Lisa's blanket. Generator fans are failing again, Brooks explained quietly to the doctor. Heat is getting worse in the laundry building. The doctor muttered under his breath while checking Lisa's pulse. We need maintenance on those fans before somebody collapses for good. Brooks nodded once. I will handle it. He turned toward the door again, but paused when he noticed Greta wringing cold water from a towel beside the cot. For one brief moment, their eyes met across the room. Greta realized suddenly that she no longer looked away first anymore. The thought unsettled her. Lise slowly recovered during the next hour while afternoon heat settled over the camp like wet blankets. Sweat gathered along Greta's collar despite the open windows. Outside, thunderclouds slowly built beyond the trees again. Summer storms arrived almost daily here. Around 4 o'clock, the first thunder rolled across the sky. Several prisoners near the yard looked upward instinctively. Within minutes, heavy rain began crashing against the camp roofs hard enough to blur the windows white. The temperature dropped slightly. Everyone in the infirmary exhaled with relief. Greta stepped near the doorway, watching rainwater flood the dirt pathways outside. Guards hurried across the compound, carrying crates beneath ponchos, while prisoners rushed indoors laughing softly at the sudden downpour. Then Greta noticed movement near the laundry building. A young American private struggled beside the broken generator cart sinking into deep mud near the fence line. One wheel spun uselessly while rain soaked both the soldier and the machine. Before anyone else reacted, Brooks crossed the yard through the storm toward him. Rain hammered against his shoulders instantly. Greta watched from the infirmary doorway as he grabbed the side of the heavy cart beside the younger soldier. Together, they pushed the generator slowly through knee-deep mud toward shelter beside the maintenance shed. The younger private looked exhausted. Brooks kept speaking calmly to him the entire time, though Greta could not hear the words through the rain. Something about the scene caught her unexpectedly. Not heroism, not drama, just quiet patience beneath miserable weather. The kind of patience her father once showed repairing broken clocks long after midnight, because customers needed them by morning. The storm intensified quickly. Lightning flashed across the camp, while rain pounded the roofs almost violently now. The infirmary lights flickered twice. Several prisoners tensed immediately. Greta felt old anxiety stir inside her chest again. Hospitals in wartime taught people to fear failing electricity. Outside, Brooks and the private finally secured the generator beneath cover near the shed. Both men stood completely soaked beneath the downpour. The younger soldier laughed breathlessly while wiping water from his face. Brooks handed him a towel from inside the shed before pulling the generator cover closed. Then something unexpected happened. The private offered Brooks a cigarette. Brooks accepted it. The young soldier lit both cigarettes carefully beneath the shelter roof while rain exploded around them in silver sheets. For several seconds, they simply stood side by side, smoking quietly beneath the storm. Equal. Ordinary. Human. Greta stared at the scene through the rain-streaked doorway. She realized suddenly that America itself still treated men like Elijah Brooks differently. She had seen enough already. Separate glances. Tension among certain guards. The way some officers spoke past him instead of directly to him. Yet Brooks still carried himself with more dignity than anyone else in the camp. The realization settled heavily inside her. Because for the first time, Greta understood prejudice not as abstract propaganda, but as something ugly and deeply personal. Something capable of blinding entire nations to simple humanity standing directly in front of them. Brooks eventually noticed her watching from the infirmary doorway. Rain dripped steadily from his cap brim as he looked across the flooded yard toward her. Neither of them moved. The moment lasted only seconds before another flash of lightning broke the silence. Greta stepped back inside automatically. But something inside her had already changed again. She no longer saw Elijah Brooks as an exception to old lies. She was beginning to understand the lies themselves. The rain left the camp washed clean the next morning. Sunlight reflected from puddles scattered across the yard, while steam rose slowly from the soaked earth beneath the growing heat. Louisiana seemed to breathe after storms. Pine trees dripped quietly beyond the fences. Birds returned to the telephone wires near the guard towers. Somewhere beside the kitchens, somebody played jazz music louder than usual through a radio while breakfast trays clattered inside the mess hall. Greta stood outside the infirmary folding clean sheets beneath the shade of the porch roof. Warm air moved softly through the camp carrying the smell of wet wood, coffee, and damp uniforms drying beneath the sun. For a few minutes, everything almost felt peaceful. Then she heard laughter near the supply shed. Not mocking laughter. Real laughter. Greta glanced across the yard and saw Sergeant Brooks beside two mechanics repairing one of the camp trucks. One of the younger soldiers balanced a wrench on his finger while speaking too quickly. Brooks leaned against the open truck hood listening with folded arms. Then he laughed quietly at something the private said. Greta stopped folding the sheet in her hands. The sound startled her more than shouting ever could have. She realized suddenly she had never imagined Black American soldiers laughing before arriving here. Propaganda had never shown ordinary moments. No families, no friendships, no humor, only fear twisted into caricatures. Yet Elijah Brooks laughed exactly the same way her older brother used to laugh before the war. Head lowered slightly, eyes closed for half a second, tired but genuine. Greta looked away immediately afterward, ashamed of the thought. Around noon, the camp doctor sent her across the compound to deliver inventory forms to the administration office near the eastern fence. Heat settled heavily over the yard again by then. Prisoners moved slowly between assignments carrying tools and laundry baskets beneath the blazing sun. Greta crossed the gravel path carefully holding paperwork against her chest while sweat gathered beneath her collar. Near the administration building, she noticed a small crowd gathered beside the water station. Several guards stood nearby while prisoners filled metal cups from large coolers packed with melting ice. Greta slowed as she approached. One of the German women near the front of the line struggled with her English while speaking to a young American private. The soldier looked impatient already. "I said move along," he snapped. The prisoner lowered her eyes immediately. "I only ask for more water," she answered softly. "Everybody asks for more water," the private muttered while reaching for the next cup. Before the tension could grow worse, another voice interrupted calmly from behind them. "Then maybe we should refill the cooler faster." Sergeant Brooks stepped beside the water station carrying two fresh ice blocks wrapped in canvas. The younger private straightened immediately. Brooks placed the ice into the cooler without another word. Cold water splashed across his hands beneath the sunlight. Then he looked toward the German woman waiting beside the station. "Take another cup," he said quietly. "Heat index is over 100 degrees today." The woman hesitated before nodding gratefully. Greta watched the entire exchange from several feet away. Brooks never embarrassed the younger soldier publicly, never raised his voice. He simply corrected the situation and moved on. Again, always dignity before authority. It unsettled her every time. After delivering the paperwork, Greta returned slowly toward the infirmary beneath the punishing afternoon heat. Halfway across the yard, she passed the maintenance shed and noticed Brooks sitting alone on the back steps beneath the shade overhang. He held a letter in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. The moment looked strangely fragile somehow. Human in a way war rarely allowed. Greta should have continued walking. Instead, she slowed near the edge of the steps. Brooks glanced up first. "Too hot to stand in the sun," he said calmly. Greta looked toward the distant fences shimmering beneath waves of heat. Hamburg never felt like this. Brooks smiled faintly. "Nobody gets used to Louisiana summers." Greta noticed the letter resting against his knee. The envelope looked worn from repeated folding. Without meaning to, she asked, "From your family?" Brooks nodded once. "My mother." He folded the paper carefully before slipping it back into his pocket. "She writes every Sunday." Greta sat carefully on the far end of the wooden steps after a brief hesitation. The boards felt warm beneath her hands from the afternoon sun. For several seconds, they simply listened to cicadas buzzing through the trees around the camp. "My mother used to write letters every week, too," Greta said quietly. Brooks looked toward her without speaking. Greta kept her eyes on the yard ahead. Even during the bombings, she always ended every letter the same way. Brooks waited patiently. Greta swallowed once before continuing. She wrote, "Do not let war turn you into somebody unrecognizable." The words hung between them softly. Brooks lowered his coffee cup slowly. "Sounds like a smart woman." Greta smiled sadly. She baked cakes during air raids because she said frightened people should still smell sugar sometimes. For the first time in weeks, speaking about her mother did not feel like reopening a wound. Maybe because Brooks listened without interruption. Without pity. Just attention. The kind of attention people rarely gave each other during wartime. Somewhere near the western fence, a whistle blew, signaling shift changes. Guards crossed the yard carrying clipboards and rifles beneath the blazing heat. One truck engine coughed loudly before starting near the garages. Ordinary camp sounds. Brooks rested his elbows against his knees. "My mother teaches piano," he said after a moment. Greta looked at him in surprise. "Piano?" He nodded slightly. "Church lessons mostly. Kids in Atlanta." Greta tried to picture it. Elijah Brooks sitting beside a piano somewhere in Georgia while sunlight crossed polished wood floors. The image felt impossible only weeks earlier. Now it simply felt real. "Do you play?" she asked. Brooks laughed quietly beneath his breath. "No." She tried. "I was terrible." Greta found herself laughing softly too before she could stop it. The sound surprised both of them slightly. Not because laughter was forbidden, because it had become rare. Brooks looked toward her again then. Truly looked at her. Not as a prisoner. Not as an enemy. Just as another exhausted human being sitting through unbearable heat in the middle of Louisiana. Greta felt the weight of that gaze more deeply than she expected. Then footsteps approached across the gravel. The younger private from the water station stopped near the shed carrying paperwork. He glanced between Greta and Brooks with visible confusion for half a second before addressing the sergeant. "Captain needs perimeter reports." Brooks stood immediately, the moment dissolving at once. "I will be there shortly." The private nodded awkwardly before walking away again. Greta rose from the steps too, brushing dust from her skirt. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Brooks adjusted the folded letter inside his pocket carefully. "Your mother was right," he said quietly. Greta frowned slightly. "About what?" Brooks looked toward the camp beyond them. Prisoners. Guards. Fences shining beneath the heat. About not becoming unrecognizable. Greta felt something tighten quietly in her chest. Because she understood then that Elijah Brooks had been fighting that exact battle long before she arrived in Louisiana. And somehow, against everything around him, he was winning. August settled over the camp with slow, relentless heat. Days blurred together beneath white skies and humming insects while the fences shimmered in the distance like thin silver lines melting into the horizon. Greta no longer counted the weeks since arriving in Louisiana. Time worked differently here. Breakfast whistles. Work assignments. Evening rain. Coffee steaming inside the mess hall each morning. The rhythm of camp life had quietly replaced the chaos she once carried inside her chest. Some of the women even laughed now from time to time. Soft, cautious laughter. The kind people used when they still feared happiness might disappear if spoken too loudly. Greta noticed the change most during evenings. Prisoners sat outside the barracks after supper watching thunderstorms gather beyond the pine trees, while radios played American music somewhere near the kitchens. Guards moved through the compound without tension. The war still existed. Everyone understood that. But inside the fences, another strange thing existed beside it now. Routine. Humanity. One afternoon, the camp commander announced an official inspection from regional military authorities arriving from New Orleans. The entire compound changed immediately. Barracks floors were scrubbed. Supply crates reorganized. Uniforms pressed. Even the guards spoke more sharply than usual. Greta spent the morning inside the infirmary helping inventory medical shelves while humidity thickened outside beneath gathering clouds. Around noon, several black military sedans rolled through the front gates, trailing dust behind them. Officers stepped out wearing immaculate uniforms despite the heat. Greta watched from the infirmary window while prisoners quietly paused work assignments across the yard. One of the visiting officers immediately caught her attention. Tall, thin, white gloves despite the weather. His movements looked clipped and impatient. He walked through the camp with the expression of a man inspecting machinery instead of people. Sergeant Brooks accompanied the inspection group alongside two other guards carrying paperwork and records. Greta noticed his posture immediately. Straighter than usual. Controlled. Careful. The visitors stopped first at the barracks, then the kitchens, then finally the prisoner work areas near the laundry station. Everywhere they went, conversations softened into silence. Greta continued organizing bandages while listening faintly to voices drifting through the open windows. Questions. Inventory numbers. Geneva Convention procedures. Standard inspections. Then the tone outside shifted suddenly. Sharper now. One of the officers spoke loudly enough for the words to carry across the yard. Why are these prisoners receiving extra rations? Greta froze beside the shelves. Outside the infirmary window, several prisoners lowered their eyes immediately. The camp doctor glanced toward the doorway, but said nothing. Another voice answered calmly. Brooks. Heat conditions, sir. Medical recommendation. The officer sounded unconvinced. These are enemy prisoners, Sergeant. Not hotel guests. Greta felt the room grow strangely still around her. Outside, nobody moved. Then came Brooks's voice again. Calm as always. They are prisoners under United States protection, sir. A pause followed. Greta moved quietly toward the doorway. Before she could stop herself, through the screen door, she saw the inspection group standing near the water station beneath the brutal afternoon sun. Sweat darkened every uniform except the visiting officers. Brooks stood facing him with hands folded neatly behind his back. Respectful. Steady. The officer removed his gloves finger by finger. I understand protocol, Sergeant. His tone sharpened slightly. But some guards here appear to be forgetting who won this war. Several nearby soldiers looked downward instantly. Nobody breathed loudly. Greta noticed one of the younger German prisoners clutching her laundry basket tighter against her chest. Brooks remained perfectly still. With respect, sir, he answered quietly. Discipline is not weakened by dignity. The sentence landed over the yard like distant thunder. Greta saw surprise flicker briefly across several faces nearby. The officer studied Brooks silently for a long moment beneath the crushing heat. Somewhere beyond the fences, cicadas screamed through the pine trees. Finally, the officer stepped closer. You seem unusually concerned with prisoner comfort, Sergeant. Brooks did not move. I am concerned with American conduct, sir. Silence followed again. Heavy silence. The kind that stretched long enough for everyone nearby to feel its weight. Greta realized suddenly how dangerous honesty could become inside uniforms. The officer eventually looked away first. Continue the inspection, he muttered sharply before turning toward the administration building. The group moved on across the yard moments later. Conversations slowly resumed around the compound in nervous, low voices. But something invisible had shifted. Greta remained standing near the infirmary doorway long after the officers disappeared. Her hands trembled slightly against the screen frame. Not from fear, from recognition. Because for the first time in her life, she had watched a man defend her dignity without expecting anything in return. Not because she was German, not because she was a woman, simply because he believed human beings deserved dignity. The realization settled deep inside her chest with painful clarity. Later that evening, thunderstorms gathered again over the camp. Warm wind pushed through the compound, carrying the smell of rain and wet earth before the first drops even fell. Greta stood beneath the barracks porch watching dark clouds swallow the sunset beyond the fences. Most prisoners had already gone inside ahead of the storm. Somewhere nearby, jazz music drifted softly from a radio through static. Then footsteps crossed the wet gravel beside the porch. Brooks stopped beneath the overhang beside her moments before heavy rain crashed down across the yard. Neither of them spoke immediately. Rain hammered the camp roofs in silver waves while lightning flashed far beyond the pine trees. Brooks removed his cap slowly, running one tired hand through damp hair before leaning against the porch rail. Greta looked toward the storm instead of at him. You should not have argued with that officer, she said quietly after a long silence. Brooks gave a faint, humorless smile. Probably not. Rainwater splashed across the wooden steps beneath them. Greta folded her arms against the warm wind. Why did you? Brooks watched the storm for several seconds before answering. Because somebody should. Simple words. Quiet words. Yet Greta felt them more deeply than speeches. She turned toward him finally. Lightning illuminated the yard behind his shoulders for one bright instant. Even for us? She asked softly. Brooks looked at her then. Directly. Calm eyes beneath the storm shadows. Especially for you. Greta could not speak afterward. Something inside her broke apart quietly in that moment. Years of propaganda, fear, distance, hatred carefully taught by strangers who had never stood in Louisiana rain beside a man like Elijah Brooks. Thunder rolled low across the camp, while rain poured endlessly beyond the porch roof. Greta realized then that the first Black American soldier she had ever truly known had not shattered her expectations through force or anger. He had shattered them through restraint, through patience, through dignity so steady it survived even in a world determined to strip dignity away from others. Summer slowly began loosening its grip on Louisiana by late September. The air still carried heat through the afternoons, but mornings arrived cooler now, touched by faint hints of autumn drifting through the pine trees beyond the camp fences. Greta noticed the change first in the light. Sunrises turned softer. Shadows stretched longer across the yard. Even the evening rainstorms came less often. The camp itself felt quieter too. Rumors moved constantly between prisoners and guards now. Germany was collapsing faster. Some prisoners spoke hopefully about going home before Christmas. Others feared what home might look like after the war finally ended. Greta no longer knew which possibility frightened her more. One evening after supper, she sat alone outside the barracks watching the sunset fade behind the western fence. The sky burned orange and gold through layers of thin clouds, while radios played softly somewhere near the kitchens. Women spoke quietly nearby, while mending uniforms beneath porch lights. For the first time in many months, the camp no longer felt temporary to Greta. That realization disturbed her deeply, because somewhere between the rainstorms, the coffee cups, and the long conversations beneath Louisiana heat, this place had stopped feeling like captivity alone. Footsteps crossed the gravel beside the porch. Greta looked up automatically. Brooks carried a small cardboard box beneath one arm. Package delivery, he said calmly. Greta frowned slightly. For me? He nodded once before handing her the box. Red Cross shipment arrived this afternoon. The cardboard felt surprisingly light in her hands. Greta opened the lid carefully beneath the fading sunset. Inside rested 2 bars of soap, folded stockings, instant coffee packets, and one small wrapped package tied with string. Her breath caught instantly. She recognized the handwriting on the paper wrapping before even touching it. Her mother's handwriting. Greta stared at the package silently while the world around her seemed to disappear for several seconds. Her mother had written that label before Hamburg fell completely silent, before the letters stopped. Slowly, Greta untied the string with trembling fingers. Inside rested a small silver pocket watch. Her father's watch. The same watch he carried every day inside the repair shop near the harbor. Greta covered her mouth immediately. For a moment, she could not breathe properly. Brooks remained quietly beside the porch rail without speaking. Greta opened the watch carefully. The hands had stopped at 2:17. Damage from bombing perhaps. But inside the cover, tiny engraved letters still remained untouched. Time reveals character. Her father's favorite phrase. Greta lowered her head suddenly as tears blurred her vision. Not violent sobbing. Just exhaustion finally breaking open after too many silent months. Brooks looked away respectfully toward the darkening yard, giving her privacy without leaving. That small kindness almost made the moment harder to survive. After several minutes, Greta finally wiped her eyes carefully. I thought everything from home was gone, she whispered. Brooks nodded slowly. Sometimes things survive anyway. The sunset faded completely while lanterns flickered across the camp. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the evening air. Greta closed the pocket watch gently in her hands. My father fixed clocks, she said quietly. He believed people revealed themselves most clearly when life became difficult. Brooks leaned one arm against the porch post. Sounds true. Greta looked toward him then. Truly looked at him beneath the dim porch light, and soft evening shadows. You proved him right. Brooks seemed slightly uncomfortable with the attention. He lowered his eyes briefly before answering. I only did my job. Greta shook her head slowly. No, the word came softer than she expected. Not only that. Silence settled between them again. Comfortable silence this time. Crickets hummed through the grass while warm wind moved gently across the compound. Finally, Brooks spoke without looking directly at her. When I was a kid, my mother used to tell me something. Greta waited quietly. She said the world will try very hard to decide who you are before you even open your mouth. Greta tightened her fingers slightly around the silver watch. Brooks continued softly. She said the important thing is deciding for yourself first. Greta felt the truth of those words settle deeply inside her chest. Because that was exactly what had happened to both of them. Entire systems deciding who they were before either had spoken a single sentence. Enemy, prisoner, black soldier, German woman. Labels placed on human beings faster than understanding ever arrived. Yet somehow Elijah Brooks had carried his dignity through all of it without letting bitterness destroy him. Greta wondered if she could ever do the same. The following week brought news that several prisoners would soon be transferred north to another processing camp. Nobody knew final destinations yet. The uncertainty spread nervous energy through the barracks immediately. Women packed belongings quietly. Some cried at night, believing they might never see familiar faces again. Greta sat awake long after lights out, holding her father's pocket watch beneath her blanket while rain tapped softly against the windows. She realized suddenly that the thought of leaving Louisiana hurt more than she expected. Not because of the camp itself, because leaving meant leaving unfinished conversations behind. The transfer orders arrived 3 days later. Greta's name appeared near the top of the list. Departure scheduled at dawn. She folded the paper slowly after reading it. Around her, other women reacted with fear or relief. Greta felt neither, only heaviness. Early the next morning, fog covered the camp again, while prisoners loaded small bags beside waiting transport trucks. Guards checked paperwork beneath dim lantern light. Engines idled softly in the cool darkness before sunrise. Greta stood near the back of the line holding her small suitcase and the silver watch carefully tucked inside her coat pocket. The world smelled like wet earth and coffee drifting from the kitchens one last time. Brooks stood beside the truck reviewing transfer documents with another sergeant. Greta watched him quietly through the fog. Same calm posture. Same polished boots damp from morning dew. He looked up eventually and noticed her standing there. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Brooks crossed the gravel slowly toward her. The camp around them blurred into soft noise. Truck engines, footsteps, distant whistles. Greta suddenly found herself unable to speak. Brooks stopped beside her suitcase. Looks like you are heading north. Greta nodded once. Looks that way. He reached into his jacket pocket, then removed something wrapped in cloth. The small wooden airplane. Fully repaired now. Greta stared at it in surprise. For the journey, he said quietly. She accepted the toy carefully into both hands. Smooth polished wings. Tiny painted stars beneath the sides. Such a small object. Yet Greta understood immediately what it really meant. Proof that broken things could still be repaired with patience. She looked up at him slowly. Thank you. Brooks nodded once. Take care of yourself, Greta. Hearing her first name spoken softly in his voice almost broke her composure again. A whistle blew sharply near the trucks. Prisoners began boarding. Greta held the wooden airplane tightly against her chest for one final second before stepping toward the transport line. Then she stopped, turned back once more. Brooks remained standing exactly where she left him beneath the pale Louisiana fog. Calm, steady, human. Greta realized then that years from now, when people asked her what shocked her most about America, she would not remember the coffee or the camp or the southern storms. She would remember the first Black American soldier she ever met, and how the world had taught her to fear him before she even knew his name. Yet in the end, Elijah Brooks became the person who quietly returned part of her humanity to her without ever asking for anything in return.